If you're still awake, you're in the right place. I'm the voice you'll hear tonight, but my name doesn't matter. All that matters is that sometimes, the things we can't explain don't stay in the shadows. They wait until the house is quiet, until the only light is your screen, to remind us that we aren't as safe as we think. Nothing here is guaranteed to be real, and nothing here is guaranteed to be gone. If you feel a chill, don't look away. Just listen. Let's get into the first one. I've never told anyone this. It happened 3 years ago in my childhood bedroom, the one I still occupy now that I'm 24. I was 21 then, living back at home for a few months after a breakup, trying to save money. It was a Tuesday in November, the kind of night where the rain drums against the window pane with a rhythm that usually lulls me to sleep. I remember lying there, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, feeling that specific kind of exhaustion that comes from too much silence and too many memories. The house was always quiet, but that night, the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing against my eardrums. I had the radio on low, just some static-filled jazz, but it sounded muffled, as if someone had turned down the volume inside the house rather than the device. I noticed the front door lock was different. Not changed, but positioned differently. I'm sure I checked it before bed, but later I'd find myself wondering if I had actually turned the key or just remembered doing it. There was a faint smell of damp earth in the hallway, despite the windows being shut tight. I thought it was just the rain tracking in from my shoes. I told myself I was overthinking it, that the house settles and smells change with the weather. I rolled over, pulled the quilt up to my chin, and tried to ignore the feeling of being watched from the corner of the room, where the shadow of my dresser seemed to stretch just a bit too far across the floorboards. The first thing that really shook me was a soft click, right around 2:15 a.m. It wasn't the house settling. It sounded like a door latch engaging on the inside, but I knew my door was locked from the outside, and I was the only one in the house. I sat up, heart hammering, and listened. Nothing. Just the rain. Then, a few minutes later, a floorboard in the hallway groaned under a weight that shouldn't have been there. I called out, just a shaky, hello, expecting my parents to be getting water or using the bathroom. They didn't answer. They never do, they're deep sleepers. But then, the radio, which I had turned off, crackled to life. Not music, just a burst of white noise that sounded like someone breathing heavily into the speaker. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. The closet door, which I always keep closed, was open an inch. I told myself the wind had pushed it, or I must have forgotten it. I got out of bed, walked over to the closet, and shoved it shut, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I walked back to bed, I saw a pair of wet footprints on the rug. They were small, barefoot, and they led from the hallway to the closet, then stopped abruptly right in front of the bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at the wet circles in the pile of the rug. I was convinced someone was inside, that the smell of earth and the locked door meant an intruder. I decided to leave the room, to go down to the kitchen and call the police. But as I stood up, I felt the mattress dip, just a fraction of an inch, right beside where I had been sitting. I froze. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees, cold enough to see my breath. Then, a whisper came from the corner of the closet, the one I had just closed. "You didn't check the back window," a voice said, sounding like it was coming from right next to my ear, though my head was turned away. I spun around, shining my phone light into the corner, but the room was empty. The closet door was still shut. I ran out, burst into the hallway, and checked the front door. It was locked. I ran back to the bathroom to splash water on my face, my hands shaking so hard I couldn't grip the soap. That's when I heard it again. Not a whisper. A distinct, wet dragging sound. It was coming from under my bed. The sound stopped right as I looked down. I grabbed the phone to call 911, but my hands were numb, the battery dead. That's when the air pressure in the room shifted, making my ears pop painfully. I saw a shadow detach itself from the wall, moving not like a person, but like a spill of ink on a floor. It had no face, just a smooth, dark surface where features should be. It crawled out from under the bed, dragging a long, thin hand that looked like it was made of wire and dust. It stopped inches from my face. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the thing leaned in, its smooth surface inches from my eyes, and for a second, I saw my own reflection in it, but my reflection was screaming silently, mouth wide open. The thing didn't touch me, it just hovered there, vibrating with a low hum that rattled my teeth. Then, just as fast as it appeared, it was gone, and the door to the hallway was wide open, the streetlights from outside casting a pale blue glow into the room. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the house was empty. They found no footprints, no signs of forced entry, and no one in the house at all. They checked the back window, which was indeed open, but the screen was intact, locked from the inside. I slept in my sister's room for the rest of the week, but I couldn't stop checking the closet. The police said I was probably sleepwalking, that the stress of the breakup had played a trick on my mind. But I know what I saw. The next morning, I went back to my room to grab my clothes, and I found the wet footprints on the rug had changed. They didn't lead from the hallway anymore. They started right in the middle of the room, where I had been standing, and they led directly into the closet, and then, there were no more prints. Just the dust. I still don't know if someone broke in and escaped through the back, or if I imagined the whole thing. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits the window, I hear that wet dragging sound again, and I can't help but check the closet door to see if it's cracked open just a little bit. This happened to me last October, 3 weeks ago. I was staying in a dilapidated cabin about 20 miles outside of a town called Oakhaven, which barely shows up on most GPS systems. The weather had turned violent that afternoon, a blizzard that locked the roads tight, forcing me to take shelter there. It was a place the locals whispered about, a spot I wouldn't have found if the rental car hadn't slipped into a ditch right on the county line. I was alone, the wind howling against the thin walls, and I thought it was just a rough night of isolation. I never expected to be the center of it. I had driven through for the quiet, hoping to escape the noise of the city. The cabin was old, smelling of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like rusted nails. I spent the first hour by the fireplace, trying to get the stove to light, the chimney spitting sparks that felt too hot, too deliberate. The isolation was complete, no phone signal, no neighbors within sight. Around midnight, I went to check the perimeter, though I knew better than to leave the door unlocked. That's when I noticed the footprints in the fresh snow. They weren't mine. They were too far inside the tree line, circling the cabin in a pattern that didn't look like a walk, more like a slow, careful crawl. I told myself it was the wind shifting the snow, or maybe a deer that had gotten confused by the drifts. I went back inside, locked the heavy iron latch, and made a mug of coffee, trying to shake the feeling of being watched from the dark window panes. The first night was just the wind, but the second morning brought the cold. It wasn't the natural chill of a blizzard, it was a pocket of absolute zero that seeped in from the corner of the bedroom, frost forming on the walls in shapes that looked disturbingly like faces pressing against the glass. I tried to call for help again, but the phone line was dead, the dial tone replaced by a low, rhythmic static that sounded like breathing. Then came the sounds from the attic. At first, it was just a dragging noise, like furniture being moved slowly across the floorboards. I climbed the stairs, flashlight shaking in my hand, but the attic was empty. Just dust and old boxes. But when I got back downstairs, the front door was open a crack. I shut it, bolted it, and sat by the window, watching the snow fall, convinced I was just being paranoid. By the third night, the rationalization stopped working. The temperature in the room dropped so low that my breath hung in the air, and the frost on the window began to form words. I couldn't read them at first, just jagged lines that shifted when I looked away. Then, the dragging sound returned, but it was coming from under the floorboards now. I dropped to my knees, pressing my ear to the wood, and heard it. It wasn't a monster, or a ghost in the traditional sense. It was the sound of something wet and heavy sliding against the subfloor, right below where I was lying. I grabbed a fireplace poker and pounded on the floor, screaming for it to stop, but the sound only got louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was down there was finally acknowledging my presence. I scrambled to the window, expecting to see a figure, but the view was blocked by a thick, black fog that had rolled in instantly, swallowing the trees and the cabin in an unnatural silence. I woke up in the cabin the next afternoon, sunlight streaming through the windows, the snow melted completely. The fire was dead, the door was locked tight, and the attic was empty. There was no sign of the frost, no footprints, no dragging sounds. I packed my car and drove straight to the nearest town, the one with the gas station and the diner, to report the incident. The owner of the cabin just looked at me with tired eyes and said the place had been empty for years. But as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin in the distance, the windows dark. And then I saw the reflection in the glass of my own back seat. It was there, right behind me, pressing its face against the window, just like the frost had formed, but this time, it was real. And I knew, with a cold certainty that chilled my bones, that it wasn't in the cabin. It was in the car with me. And I still have no idea how it got inside. I've never told anyone this, not even my sister when she called me a few months ago to ask why I still flinch at the sound of an elevator dinging. It was late, around 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was on the night shift at the St. Jude's emergency room loading dock. The rain was hammering against the corrugated metal roof, a relentless, white noise that usually helped me focus on the inventory logs I was supposed to be updating. I was the only one in the building besides the security guard, who was dozing in his booth, and the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic was thick in the air. The fluorescent lights overhead were flickering, casting that familiar, sickly green hue that makes everything look a little too clean and a little too dead. I had been working the graveyard shift at the loading bay for 3 years, and I knew the rhythm of the place better than my own heartbeat. We mostly received medical supplies and pharmaceuticals in the wee hours, just pallets of sterile boxes being wheeled in by the delivery drivers who never looked you in the eye. I had a system. I'd check the manifest, verify the seal on the crate, and sign it off. That night, the third delivery of the shift came through at 3:22 a.m. It was a small crate, marked with a standard shipping label, not the usual large refrigerated units. I took the barcode scanner and clicked it against the box. The scanner beeped, but the screen just showed a string of zeros. I thought maybe the battery was dead in the scanner, or perhaps the label was damp from the rain outside. I wiped the box with my sleeve and tried again. Same result. It was just a glitch, a minor technical failure in a building that ran on old wiring and bad habits. I decided to just write down the manifest number and let the morning supervisor handle the discrepancy. I didn't think much of it. I never do. I just wanted to get home before the sun came up. But the silence changed. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it felt like the air had become too thick, like breathing water. The flickering of the fluorescent lights above me stopped. It wasn't a flicker anymore, but a slow, rhythmic dimming, like a giant heart slowing down. The scanner in my hand suddenly grew warm, then hot to the touch. I dropped it, and it clattered onto the concrete floor, but it didn't make a sound. The impact was muffled, swallowed instantly by the quiet. I looked up at the security camera in the corner of the ceiling. The red light that usually blinked was gone, just a dead, dark lens staring back at me. Then, I heard the footsteps. They weren't coming from the door, they were coming from the rafters, right above my head. A slow, heavy drag, like something with too many legs being pulled by a rope. I spun around, shouting for the guard, but my voice didn't carry. I could see my mouth moving, but no sound came out. The air grew cold, freezing the sweat on my brow. I tried to run to the intercom, to call the guard, but my legs wouldn't obey. I could feel a presence pressing against the back of my neck, not a touch, but a weight, a pressure that made my teeth ache. Then, the crate I had been scanning began to open. There was no lock, no mechanism to undo, just a slow, organic peeling of the cardboard as if it were made of skin. Inside, There was no box of needles or bandages. There was a mirror, or at least a surface that reflected perfectly, except the reflection showed me standing there, but the figure in the mirror wasn't moving. It was just standing, staring at me with a look of absolute, hollow horror. Then, the reflection raised its hand and pointed at me, but the direction it was pointing was impossible. It was pointing at the space directly behind me, where the air was already bending, warping like heat haze over asphalt. A sound started then, a low hum that vibrated through my bones, vibrating the very marrow in my skull. It wasn't a noise I could hear, it was a noise I could feel in my teeth, in my eyes, in the fluid of my inner ear. The reflection in the mirror smiled. It was a smile that didn't use a mouth, just a stretching of the air that made my skin crawl. I realized, with a cold clarity that froze my blood, that the thing in the mirror wasn't looking at me. It was looking at whatever was behind me, and it was waiting for me to turn around. I ran. I don't remember how I got off the loading dock, but I was sprinting down the long hallway toward the front entrance, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The doors to the outside were locked, which is absurd because I could see the keypad right there, glowing in the dark. I pounded on the glass, screaming, but no one answered. The security guard's booth was empty. The lights in the hallway flickered, and for a second, I saw the guard standing there, but he was facing the wall, and his back was to me, just staring at the concrete. I finally forced the door open and stumbled out into the rain, gasping for air that didn't taste like ozone. I called the police immediately, but when they arrived, they found the loading dock empty. The crate was gone. The scanner was gone. The guard said I had never entered the building that night, that I had just come in from a long shift earlier and was hallucinating from fatigue. I went home, but I can't stop thinking about the mirror. The next morning, I checked my reflection in the bathroom mirror at home, trying to convince myself I was fine, that I was just stressed. But when I looked into the glass, the water from the sink was dripping from the faucet, and in the reflection, the water was dry. My hair was still wet, but the reflection's hair was dry. I blinked, and the reflection blinked, but a second later. I looked away, and when I looked back, the reflection was still looking at me, even though I had turned my head. I ran to the front of the mirror, peering into the glass, and for a split second, I saw my own face behind me, standing in the doorway of my own bedroom. It wasn't a trick of the light. The face was looking at me with that same hollow horror. I still don't know what happened, or if I'm just imagining it, but I keep checking the time. The mirror clock in my bathroom is running backward. I'm not sure I can explain any of that. Maybe you've had something similar happen to you, or maybe you know someone who has. If you've ever had an experience that defies logic, please share it in the comments. We're all just trying to make sense of the strange. In the next video, we dive into stories that are even harder to explain. If you want more of these late-night mysteries, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for listening.